Good afternoon and good evening. My name is Steve Ortega, and I'm the head of the Global Sports Initiative at the Weatherhead Center at Harvard. And I'm an associate professor of global history at Simmons University. The Global Sports Initiative was created to promote transnational discussions amongst different people in the sports community. We have hosted 3 conferences in which diverse athletes and scholars have participated. Today is a part of the series, The History of the Future, in which we look at contemporary global issues as a way to better understand future challenges and as a means for giving future generations a more complete record for better comprehending their past. We are happy to present sports in the time of COVID. This will be a unique discussion between individuals involved in sports and committed to the industry's ability for doing social good and providing us with hope for a better future in a moment of global despair. If we are to arrive to a better place, it is essential that these discussions not only take place, but also that they provide a meaningful call to action. As Mahatma Gandhi aptly noted, the future depends on what we do in the present. Before introducing our guests, there are a number of people that I would like to acknowledge for making this event possible. To Sven Beckert and Jessica Barnard, a part of the Initiative on Global Transformations, and Ted Gilman, the Executive Director of the Weatherhead Center, thank you very much for supporting this program and promoting these global discussions. To Sabrina Carrozza of FC Barcelona, my deepest appreciation for a Herculean effort without which this program never would have happened. Your commitment is unwavering in believing in the capacity of sports to help in great times of need. To India Robinson, the manager and business partner of Malcom Jenkins, my deep gratitude for making things happen. Getting positive things done helps change take place, and your efforts are highly regarded. To Ferran Prieto, the agent for Pau Gasol, my thanks for including Pau in this conversation and adding to our intellectual exchange. To Darren Graves, a contributor to the Global Sports Initiative and an academic colleague at Simmons University, thank you very much for brainstorming ideas related to the event and for handling our social media work. To David Harris of the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute at Harvard on Race and Justice at Harvard Law School, thank you for keeping us on the path to better outcomes. With that said, we are very excited about our discussants for today's program. From Barcelona, Jordi Cardoner is the first Vice President for FC Barcelona and the head of the Barca Foundation. From Philadelphia, Malcom Jenkins is a player for the New Orleans Saints, the co-founder of the Players Coalition, an executive film producer, and a fellow at the Weatherhead Center. From the West Coast, Pau Gasol is an NBA player, an entrepreneur, a philanthropist, and a strategic advisor and ambassador for FC Barcelona. And from Bangalore, India, Salil Shetty is a fellow at the Carr Center for Human Rights at the Kennedy School at Harvard University and the former Secretary General for Amnesty International. Salil will provide commentary at the end of the session. Maya Angelou, the great late American poet and activist, said that when you learn, teach, when you get, give. The quote gives us the opportunity to think about responsibility, the responsibility of the academy, and the role of corporate social responsibility in producing ethical outcomes. In the spirit of the first half of this quote, from the academy's perspective, we try to use our research and our areas of knowledge as a way to teach students and the general public how to address complex questions that explain the world better. Hopefully, this ideal is rooted in what we practice, although admittedly, it doesn't always work because the complexities of life and the university intervene and limit our ability to make a difference. Thinking about the second half of the quote, I would like to ask Jordi Cardoner, when what Angelou refers to as the get has been reduced, and I'm thinking now in terms of lost revenues, the lack of opportunity to play games, and the give becomes more difficult for philanthropic ventures at your organization. How did Barca reach the decision to find a sponsor for the Camp Nou for the next year so that the club could use those funds for COVID relief?
Well, first of all, thanks to all of you. and it's honored to be here and to participate together in this discussion. This was a long night, and I thought about it. This was something that the day after I called the president just in terms to talk about my thought. We discussed a little bit, and he said me, go ahead. And we introduced the suggestion to our board 2 weeks later, after developing the subject, the project by itself. And this is part of our commitment as well with society. When we said that Barca is more than a club, at the end, it's not because we are better playing than others. This is just a competition. We talk about social commitment, social responsibilities, and we thought that why not our first asset, the Camp Nou, should be supporting those the situation, this extraordinary, this crazy situation that we'll live all together. And this was an opportunity as well to bring back to the society, to those 350 million supporters we have all around the world. And we are proud of that. We want to do it, and we are proud about of this possibility.
Could you talk a little bit further about how your strategic partnerships will be used to bring this about?
Well, this is, as you said, this is our strategically networking. We have a lot of companies, a lot of organizations, a lot of institutions that we have a good relationship with. And now our team is looking at the best partner for this long trip. We hope this is something that should start now, but unfortunately it will continue for long time, because we are not just there to invest in trying to find medicines, vaccines against coronavirus. We are there as well to beat the consequences that today we are not able to define and to know, but we will find a lot of them socially talking all around the world. And we want to be prepared, and we want to have a partnership, a platform with big companies, with big players as well, with all people, why not with other clubs as well, that they want to reach us in front of these challenge that we will have in future.
Now, are you working with Nike and other people that you have as sponsors to provide COVID relief, and I know in terms of masks and other things, I think there's some work being done in this regard?
We did a big job as well here with not just with Nike. We do it with the Taiping Life Insurance, in China, with Beko, with Nike, with Tencent Foundation, with Mission Hill, our partner in China. We talk about more than 300,000 masks with civil and medical use. We talk about 15,000 medical protective equipments, and more than 10,000 glasses, and as well with a very nice work with our fan clubs all around Spain. Basically, we have 1,250 fan clubs, and all of them basically they focus on helping and supporting people in a bank of food, and supporting as well with Red Cross. We made a wonderful work, amazing to people that they needed more than ever. And that's the way that a club like Barca, it's close to reality today.
Thank you. I'd like to move a little bit and think a little bit further about how we kind of move from sort of club to individual, and particularly to the individual athlete. So next, I'd like to turn to Pau Gasol. In the U.S., particularly in lieu of Colin Kaepernick's activism, questions have been raised as to what is the appropriate role of athletes in political and social discussions. Arguably, the pandemic has elevated the necessity for greater athlete involvement in public discourse. What role do you feel that athletes should have in helping the general public deal with the crisis, and what initiatives have you taken to date in this regard?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, Stephen, and everyone else. It's a pleasure to be part of this group and this discussion. I think athletes can play a critical role during this time, during this pandemic, especially in crisis. I think athletes have a tremendous platform in order to attract people and lead movements. So I would encourage any athlete and every athlete to try to do that in a positive manner. So I myself, for instance, in Spain, we led this initiative with Rafa Nadal, and we had a conversation. He reached out. We talked on the phone. We're good friends, and we say, hey, we got to do something. We got to put something together to lead a coordinated effort and try to bring in more athletes across the country, and also all of our partners and everyone that it's kind of involved and transcends even away from sports. So we were able to raise, I think, almost about 10 million euros right now with the Red Cross, what we call our best victory. And hundreds of athletes have contributed to it. It's been a huge movement. Society really appreciates this. I mean, we rely on our fans to do what we do, and we benefit from their support constantly from home or coming to games. It's now our time to step up and lead efforts to make sure that we give back to those families in need, to those most affected, especially the most vulnerable. Also through our foundation, the Gasol Foundation, we understand this is a very critical time, challenging time, where habits have been disrupted by being confined, by being sheltered in place. So we are being extremely active, sending out audiovisual content to make sure that we promote healthy routines at home, what we call the healthy quarantine. And we encourage people to be physically active at home, to eat well, continue to eat well, to do activities that provide good emotional well-being at home. So that leads to good quality of rest. And we want to make sure that we get out of this crisis and this pandemic stronger and better than what we were before, and that this doesn't have terrible lasting effects on our health. So that's some of the things that that I've been doing. Also with UNICEF, I've been a part of two campaigns. I'm a Goodwill ambassador for UNICEF. So the uninterrupted learning, to take advantage of this time to learn. We were talking about how we can be more tech savvy during these times earlier before our talk, but we can learn anything. This is a good opportunity for us to do things that we weren't able to do before. So one of my favorite sayings is from one of the Stoics that I'm a fan of. It's not what happens to you, it's how you react to it that matters. So we can react in a positive way, in a constructive way, as we going through this uncertainty and this adversity.
This is a global discussion, and do you notice kind of how are relief efforts, would you say, in Europe involving athletes and relief efforts in the United States? Are they similar? Are they different? How can we compare them?
Well, I don't know if you can compare them, but I feel that there's a lot of similarities of things that are potentially doable. And what I try to also lead here in the U.S. is kind of like have those coordinated efforts and initiatives where athletes across different sports and across leagues kind of get together and push out a call to action together, putting out all the differences aside, all the competitiveness aside, all the egos aside, and just chip in and partake for the common good, and that's hard to do for athletes because we're so competitive. We want the credit, we want to beat you, but this is not about that, right? We're trying to give back. We're trying to help a tremendous need that it's going on right now, and it's going to continue for a while. We're still cannot grasp the lasting effects of this crisis, of this virus. So that's what I would encourage a lot, just to get on a call. Just get a few athletes together across the board and help those families that are in most in need right now.
Thank you. Okay, so we've kind of gotten the perspective of a club and an individual athlete. So I'd like to think now more about an athlete's organizations. And one initiative that has been very sort of important in American sports recently is the Players Coalition, of which Malcom Jenkins is one of the co-founders. And their mission is as follows. And, quote, our mission of the Players Coalition is to achieve social and racial equality, using Players Coalition influence and support to impact systemic social and civic change in the areas of police and community relations, criminal justice reform, and education and economic advancement in low-income communities. So to Malcom Jenkins, in line with the initiative's mission and with your hope to bring about systemic change, what type of work has the Players Coalition done for communities in need at the time of COVID?
Yeah, I think the Players Coalition, we focus on communities that
You
are
know, I
most
think that,
affected by
and you and I have talked
systems,
about this,
that
and
we're
I think
governed by,
that
whether it's our
the
criminal
ways in
justice
which,
system,
you know,
healthcare,
also you see
school and
resilience in these
education, all these
communities as
things.
well.
And usually you find communities of color or poor communities are at the bottom of the totem pole when it comes to resources and aid. And so they're usually most affected. And so I think we sat back for a while just to see, how the numbers played out. And then we started to see, like normal, communities of color were hit a lot harder with the, deaths by the virus, as well as we start looking at the financial aspect of it, who's able to stay home at work, who makes up the body of what we consider to be essential workers, our bus drivers, our sanitation, all the people who, are usually those lower wage citizens, but also communities of color that are forced to work, that don't have the resources to stay home. But, we're not, as we're kind of behind the eight ball trying to catch up to this virus, oftentimes are most affected, and we saw that in all of the data. So for what we did as a coalition was came up with over $3 million that we spread out amongst organizations that deal with healthcare, grassroots organizations, but also food banks around the country. We activated in about 7 different states because we recognize that, one, there's a healthcare crisis that needs support, but 2, with people staying home without being able to go to work, food is the number one thing that people need to be able to shelter in place. So we're helping out with food banks. And then you have these other grassroots organizations that are doing, work and supporting communities that need that help. So we focused on places like Baltimore, Chicago, New Orleans, a few other places. But and even, as we get into the community, we understand a little bit more now what the new norm is going to be. And if this is how we're having all of our meetings and people are staying connected and getting information, well, you have people who are in these poor communities or communities of color that don't have internet access, don't have access to laptops, devices, tablets and things like that. So there's also a technology gap that is now becoming a little bit more significant. And so for us, we've been thinking about ways to get internet access to people, to get devices to people, while kids are sitting at home, and schooling is moving more toward a virtual experience. There's going to be a need for those low-end communities, the low-income communities, to have access to that technology, to be able to, partake in the direction that society is now moving, on top of just dealing with the crisis in general. So there's a lot of need, and I think, as athletes, we have the ability to advocate for people. We have the ability to bring these issues to light and draw support. But also, I think for us is really just to sound the horn and continue to sound the horn and be that microphone for those people. While we talk about how everybody in general is dealing with the crisis, as we should, I think it's important for athletes, especially people who have a platform like us, to really represent those who are most affected, most vulnerable, and oftentimes undersupported.
Could you talk about the ways in which you have seen resilience in the communities that you're dealing with?
Well, I think when you talk about communities of color, resilience is, there's a long history there of that, especially in America and in our own history of having to, constantly kind of overcome the next, wave of things. Whenever America as a country gets hit with something, usually communities of color catch the worst of it. So that calls for a lot of, community togetherness, that calls for innovation, that calls for a lot of creativity. And I think you're starting to see that. Unfortunately, I think there's another part of it where people are struggling to figure out what's new and trying to get back to what was normal. And I quite frankly don't think that we're headed towards anything normal or what we used to be. And so I think there's a need for leaders at this point in time, because people are looking for some hope. They're looking for something to, some direction. And I think the more leaders that we have standing up, the more hope people have, the more creative they get, the more ideas they get. But I think when you look at what is happening with entrepreneurship, with just innovation and how people are adjusting to it, especially in these communities of color, people who have to work, who have to find ways to put food on the table, outside of kind of the assistance that's coming through the government. I can say it's been very interesting, and I've been proud to watch people really, keep that resolve and that hope as we push forward, knowing that, we can't sit still, and it's not going away anytime soon, and people are pressing forward, and it's impressive.
Thank you. So I'd like to kind of move a little bit towards what's coming next, towards the future. And I'd like to imagine that what sports is going to do might do in the future to sort of not only alleviate this situation, but to think about how we may need to live differently. So I'd like to first address this to Pau Gasol. Given the sorts of risks that are involved to players, to staff, and ultimately to fans, what are the things that you would like to prioritize in order to be able to restart the competition in a way that balances health, entertainment, and revenues? And how can the NBA act as a model for other industries considering similar questions?
Well, it is $1 million question, I feel, for everyone, right? As everyone is trying to resume some type of new normality. I think the NBA, just like the NFL and MLB, every major league, every sport league, is trying to figure out how to get back to functioning to a certain degree. And I think you have to prioritize safety. So it's you have to limit and minimize the risk as much as possible. And now they're talking, then you have to be able to test pretty much on a daily basis, everyone involved. You got to be able to put everyone in one place and isolate them from the rest of the world. So again, minimizing risks. They're talking about potentially having one venue, one site to resume the NBA and be able to finish out the season in as much of a safe manner as possible. But now we have to deal with the variables, and what if a positive comes along? What if a few positives come along? How do you deal with that? So you have to be prepared for the downside and the risk that we're all exposed to right now until we have a vaccine. That's just the reality. So, but I'm confident that the NBA, the players want to play, the players want to get back to action. The society, I think, has a need to have sports in their life, even if it's at home, as a form of entertainment, as a form of positive feeling. So I'm hopeful that the NBA will figure it out. I think Adam Silver is working hard with the league and the NBPA to kind of figure that out as quickly as possible, and hopefully within the next month make a final decision about this current season, and then we'll think about the next one later on. But right now it's they were able to stop it. The NBA was one of the first ones, or the first one to stop their activity, thanks due to the positive of Rudy Gobert and then Donovan Mitchell. And that was a great step, and that was important. But I think Adam will be more proud to be able to resume now under the conditions, and he would feel a lot better if he was able to figure that out and be successful at it. Just like we see now leagues in Europe being resumed. In Germany, the soccer league, the Bundesliga, it's now back in action. We see some type of level of sports here in the US. I think with the UFC fighting and other sports are kind of like getting back into activity, but obviously without fans, with only essential people around. And that's what every league is doing right now, because the financial hit that everyone and the economic implications are tremendous for everyone from top to bottom. And I'm talking about also the part-time workers at arenas, and we saw a lot of NBA players kind of stepping up to support those in-game workers that depend on getting those checks, that live check to check, and we saw a lot of players kind of step up and do that. So that continues to be of high relevance, right? And that's what do you put first, health or economic implications and effects that could lead to tremendous health also issues, so that's where everyone is trying to figure that out, kind of find that sweet spot, which is very hard under the current circumstances.
Are there any discussions with the Bundesliga? I mean, is there any dialogue that takes place between the NBA and the Bundesliga, between the NBA Players Association, or because that is a model in a sense?
Right. I think at this point, what we all have to be really aware of, and we probably, that's one of the takeaways from this pandemic, is we got to learn from each other. And I don't know if there's direct talks from the league and the Bundesliga at this point, but everyone is paying close attention to what's going on and to see what's being done, what's working, and what we can apply here, right? So I think everyone is kind of like on top of that. It's very hard to be one of the first ones, and Germany is one of the countries that has been able to handle this pandemic very successfully, with very, I think, low number of cases, very low number of deaths, very, so they've been very impressive. That's not the case in the United States. That's not the case in Spain in some, so we're not quite in that same, let's say, scenario. So you have to keep that into account, but nevertheless, you can still learn what works, what doesn't work, why certain things are a certain way, and really just pay attention to what's going on outside of your borders, outside of your cities or countries.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'd like to come back to Jordi Cardoner for a second, and so we've been forced to live with this uncertainty, and in many ways it has become the new normal. And one might argue, and I think it's the reason, that we've named this the history of the future, that we have entered our future, and then disruption will become a more regular part of our lives. So how might a global organization like FC Barcelona imagine its leadership role in increasingly unstable times?
Oh, now it's okay. Sorry. Yeah.
Oh, that's okay.
Okay, yeah. I said that it's a quite difficult question again, with difficult answer anyway, because it's a new subject, a new circumstance, a new situation, and it's not easy to imagine what will happen in future. But we know, that at the end of the day, the global it's a global problem. I mean that we are not the only ones affected by. Everyone is affected, so it means that rules are the same in all countries, basically. And this is as well something that came to our minds, that our best and stronger asset, it's our people all around the world. Before I said 350 million people supporting us, followers. This is really, really incredible. Barca has been the leading club on social network during the COVID crisis, and from March 12 to May 14, the club generated 178 million interactions on its social network, ahead of our competitors, following by Manchester United 160, Liverpool 140, Real Madrid 119, Bayern 50. I mean that we can face those situations as well, because we are there, we are still there, and we are convinced that our people, they need us. And when I say they need us, it means that they need as well to be close to their club, to be close to their players, to be close to the real situation that we are that we have in front. And this will be a part of the history, and we have to move a little bit ahead, and then we will come back and we will see what had happened during this war, this difficult situation. But we are convinced that because we have the people close to us, we will win as well this long and social competition.
I guess the irony of 19 is we've shut all our borders down, but yet this is as global event as one could ever imagine, because it's something that started in a wet market in Wuhan, China, and it sort of circled the globe. And I wonder about the ways in which, I think a lot of those borders need to be brought down. And as you talk about Barca as really a global entity, maybe as global an entity as any sports club in the world. And I mean, is there a lesson there maybe for other people to learn about the ways in which one can gain a more global outlook?
Sorry, I agree, and as Pau said before, and I'm convinced that we have to learn of each other's, and there are a lot of things to do, but there are a lot of things to discover as well, because as I insist that we are in front of a new reality, and this will not be easy. Our situation today, and the way we move as government, as board of a club, our management, it's completely different than a month ago. Today we think day by day, we take decisions in the day, and we have to balance every day the impact of our decisions we took yesterday. And this is a new complete situation, and we have to be very careful. We have to share that with other clubs. We have to share that with all the social agents as well, in terms to make the best for the people that they are suffering, and to be very careful, because sport is there, spectacle is there, but we should be close to the people. Today, this is more important than goals, that matches, than competition, than championships, and that economics, unfortunately. So we have to balance all that, to mix it, and to be successful by fighting with this terrific virus.
I'd like again to turn to Malcom, and thinking about beyond kind of an individual sport, or thinking beyond an individual club. What should the role of sports be in dealing with this crisis, both now and in the future? I mean, how can sports be a source for good, a source for change, a source for a better understanding?
Well, I think sports has always been that to society, right? Like everybody, worldwide enjoys sports, and athletic competitions is why the Olympics, is what it is. We love to compete, and we love our athletes in our sports. But I think what all leagues, and especially the NFL, as popular as it is in the United States, is trying to balance, with all of the things, what do you have to put in place in order to safely, continue sports for the players, the clubs involved, and also the fans? And is it worth it, at the end of the day? And so I think before we can get to a place where we give relief, through our sports, we have to get to a place where we can do it safely. And I don't think we are there yet, especially in our league. There's so many, variables that haven't been, put together yet, different than the NBA, where you can probably especially for, the playoffs and things like that, you can put the entire league in one city and isolate everybody. We showed up to training camp with 90 guys on every team, 32 different teams. You got, the facilities, coaching staff, the janitors, chefs, everybody who's involved in making our sport go, all under one roof. And I think, from a testing standpoint to what are the protocols when if somebody does test positive, how does that affect the entire league? I think there's just so many things right now that we can't guarantee to do it in a safe way. And I think, until then, our responsibility as athletes and just as a sport in general is to continue to, preach about safety, preach about patience, making sure that we understand how important sports are, especially in times of crisis, and how it can galvanize, a country, galvanize the world, bring people together. But if we can't do it safely, then it's not beneficial to, not the athletes, not the fans or anybody. So, right now we're just in a tough situation where we're waiting to see how this plans out. But I think our league, different than in individual sports or the smaller team sports, is going to have to reimagine, different ways. We're a gladiator sport that fills up 100,000, fans in a stadium week in and week out. And I don't think that's going to be our future. So it's going to be interesting to see how we adjust and adapt to be able to, like I said, bring, that joy to people who love their teams, love their players, but also do it in a way that's responsible and sets a good example for other sports and, leagues, because it's not just the NFL. You got collegiate, football all the way down to Pop Warner and little kids that always follow our lead. So I think it's important for us to set a great example.
Okay, I'd like to broaden this discussion about the future and now turn to Salil Shetty, our respondent, and ask Salil to speak with our discussants about some of the larger issues that have come out of our conversation. So Salil, from the perspective of India, from the perspective of the global South and of those most threatened by the consequences of COVID-19, how might sports be able to help? And what do you anticipate being the major challenges as we move forward?
Thank you, Steve. First of all, thank you all for having me here. I'm very grateful. I feel that I'm very honored to be in a very sort of non-representative sample of the sporting world, because I think each of you are representing the people, the foundations, the organizations which really care about issues. You're very sensitive to the human condition, so I'm very honored to be with you. So, Steve, I think I wanted to kind of, maybe show that image which you have. I don't know if you can show it at some point, but, I was wanting to talk about what the world is facing in terms of three crises, or three H's. One is a health crisis, the second is the humanitarian crisis, and the third is a human rights crisis. Now, the interesting thing is that the health crisis, you could argue, although President Trump would question it, is not a man-made crisis, whereas the humanitarian crisis and the human rights crisis are human-made crisis, man-made, mostly men, because not many leaders are women in the world. So I would say that, we have two man-made crises and one probably something which is outside human control. And broadly speaking, what has happened in the poor countries in the global South, what we've seen so far is that, the numbers started coming from China, South Korea, then Europe, and then North America, particularly the United States. And I would say that the poor countries and the leaders of the global South panicked in late March, looking at what was happening in terms of number of COVID deaths and number of cases in these countries. 2 months later, the fact is that we have not had a massive number of cases and we have had relatively few deaths. Our death rate is very, very low compared to what the Western countries have seen. So this is a very unusual disease, because normally diseases really hit poor countries the most. This is, I would say, probably one of the first major diseases in our lifetime, which has hit the richest countries the most. So if you look at the situation in India today, we have about 100,000 cases, about 3,000 deaths. which, for a country with 1.3 billion people is close to nothing. And in fact, India's death rate is higher than most other developing countries. So if you take Brazil and Turkey out of the equation, because Brazil and Turkey are very particular, they're different. They're developing or emerging countries, but very different because they're much more linked to the international route, whether it's Europe or the United States. But in the other parts of the developing world, what we have seen essentially is that because we have a very young population, for example, in India, I would say not more than 10 or 15% of the population is over the age of 65, 70. And that's true in most developing countries. We have a young demographic. We are mostly rural, and we have very little mobility inside the country and internationally. So we have been so far saved from a major health crisis. The thing is, we have no public health system to talk about. Most developing countries don't have a public health system. If we had been hit in the way that Europe or the United States or Australia would have been hit, then we would be in a lot of trouble by now. So I think we have the crisis we're really facing today is not so much a health crisis. It's triggered by a health crisis, but what we're facing is a massive humanitarian crisis, and that's the image which I wanted Steve to show you if it's possible, but it's not very central to the presentation. If you can, I don't want you to get into a dizzy, Steve, trying to get your PowerPoint up and running on a full slide. So, but if it is possible, we can just show it and I wanted to just show this picture to tell you about, the most visible issue right now in India is the issue of what we're calling migrant laborers in India. So this is, the estimated numbers are between 40 million to 100 million. We don't even know how many people these are. They are mostly people who work in the major cities, the metropolitan cities of India, who are construction laborers. They might be working in restaurants. They might be domestic help in people's houses. And as soon as the government decided to go for a complete lockdown, because they were panicking from what they saw in the West, now this 40 to 100 million people have no work, they have no wages, they have no shelter because most of them used to live on the construction sites or in people's houses or restaurants. They were asked to leave the place. They have no savings. And the government of India, unlike most of the countries, also announced an immediate shutdown to public transport. So a lot of these people are living 1,000 to 2,000 kilometers away from the metropolitan city. So they waited for a week or two, and then in the last 2 weeks, they've decided to start walking back. So you can imagine they're walking 1,000 kilometers or 2,000 kilometers. So we now have probably more deaths from starvation and exhaustion than from COVID-19. So, and this is a massive public embarrassment for the country and the government, that for the poorest people who've built our cities, who built our highways, we are unable to take care of their lives. So this is the humanitarian crisis, I would say, is that's fine, thank you, Steve. I would say that's the biggest crisis we're facing today. And the health crisis is probably going to come. We are expecting that in June or July, according to WHO, etc., that we might have a real wave of COVID cases and deaths in June, July. We don't know. The thing is that until now, every single model that's been made for the global south has gone wrong. So we don't really know. And there's all sorts of theories that a less virulent strain has hit the global south, that we have some immunity from BCG and tuberculosis, or that the temperature is higher here, so therefore we're not, but we don't really, those are not factually established. The fact is that we have a lower, a much younger population, and that's definitely helping us. So I mentioned the health crisis, which is probably coming later, and we are simply unable to handle that because in India, for example, we're not testing. So we don't really know actually how many cases there are. And no country in the world can test 1.3 billion people anyway. So, we are not in a position to say how many cases we have, but we can say, I think with some level of certainty, that we have far fewer deaths in comparison to the rich countries. So that's a health crisis and the humanitarian crisis. The third crisis is the human rights crisis. Now, what do governments do in these countries? They treat this as a law and order problem because most of the poor people now want to walk back to their homes, or, they're starting to protest, and then it's basically the police start, attacking the protesters. As it is, the media is very pliant. It's not independent in India already. Our judiciary and parliament is virtually shut down. We have a new app which has been launched, which people suspect is a surveillance, really a surveillance app. It's meant to be a health surveillance app, but there's a lot of fear that the government is going to use that as a surveillance machine beyond the health issue. And all of the points which Malcolm made about vulnerability, about discrimination issues, are all playing out. So there's an attack, a kind of Islamophobic attack on Muslims. There's a massive increase in domestic violence against women, and the lowest castes, which are kind of the racially discriminated in the Indian context, are also under attack. So all of this is playing out as we speak. So just to kind of take it, Stephen, from that kind of description to where do we go from here? I don't know if you want me to say something about that right away.
Yes, I'd love you to. I'd love you to sort of think about the ways in which sports can sort of begin to, well, I mean, I think, the sporting industry does think globally, but in kind of intertwining these stories together and what you've heard from Jordi and Malcom and Pau, how does this all relate to one another?
So, it's very appropriate, because it was interesting that the way I was thinking about it has resonated a lot with what Jordi and Pau and Malcom have described the situation as well. Because if you think about it, this crisis is truly global. The virus is not respecting national boundaries, but our leaders are trying to solve it by putting up boundaries, as you said, and trying to address it nationally. And what we are seeing is that at the global level, there is a complete failure of global institutions and global leadership. There's no question about that. I think we're just in a peculiar time in human history where the major countries in the world are led by leaders who are not inspiring confidence in their own people and are not inspiring confidence globally, the political leadership. So I think that so if you look at what is our diagnosis of the problem and then what can sport do for it, I think one is that, there is really a vacuum in terms of global leadership, ethical global leadership. And I think people are looking, as Malcolm said, to maybe sports leaders, sports icons for hope and for leadership. So there's a space there which has opened up. I don't want to, overstate it or exaggerate it, but I do think that there is a vacuum and a space which is usable. And I think, as Jordi said, with 350 million people kind of following Barca, so you have an audience who look up to, some of the sporting icons at a time when trust in national leadership is very, very low in many, many countries. Interestingly, the trust in local leadership and in key workers has shot up, but the trust in national leadership in many, many countries has really come crashing down. So one is the ethical leadership failure. The second is that exacerbating situation about inequality. And I think, again, I think the Barcelona FC and the foundation are very conscious of the issue of inequality and discrimination, and I think Pau and I think also Malcolm really highlighted this. So I think the question of where do we intervene, I think that's a space where if we can focus on the vulnerable and highlight the issue of exacerbated inequalities, I think that's a very important question. And a very concrete thing in that sense is when it comes to the whole issue of vaccines. Now, as you know, there's going to be a race to the bottom on the vaccines issue, because when we do end up having a vaccine, there's a big debate about who's going to get access to that vaccine. And that debate is taking place both within countries as to who's going to get it, but also, in a north-south sense, because the US, of course, is already saying, I'm sure you saw what happened at the French. Sanofi has said that they are already allocated the biggest chunk of vaccines to the United States. And let's say that if it does go to the United States, it's not the people that Malcolm is speaking for who are going to get the vaccines inside the United States. So, you have a north-south kind of inequality, and then you have a north-north inequality as well within the country. So I think I wanted to just mention that. So practically speaking, the way I was looking at it, Steve and all our other friends, is that, so if you think of actions which can be taken at the local, national, and global levels, I feel that a lot of the teams and the individual athletes have, obviously, they had no choice but to already act in the local context. Some of them have acted in the national context. The question is, can we do a lot more at the national level and a lot more at the global level? A lot of what has happened so far is in the fundraising space, and that's very, very important because obviously there is a real shortage of resources. So everything that each of you have done personally and as institutions, I think are very, very important. But the other two arenas where I feel that all of you can do a lot more if it is possible, one is the advocacy, and I think what you called microphone space, Malcolm, is kind of there. There's a big opportunity to do stuff. And then on the mobilization and campaigning, and I'm drawing a distinction between the two because the advocacy is more kind of focused on governments to say, can governments act ethically in a moment like this? Whereas the mobilization campaigning is with your base, that 350 million. And I expect that a very high proportion of that will be young people. So for example, a campaign which is focused on, say, youth for equality, youth against discrimination in the context of COVID. I mean, we have to think about what this means in practice. Obviously, in 30 minutes, we're not going to solve the world's problem.
Cricket is a big sport in India, correct?
Yeah.
What are the cricket teams or the cricketers, as being one of the mains? When I went to India in 2010, they asked me about cricket and all that. Obviously, I'm not very familiar with the sport, but what are the cricketers? What is the world of sports in India doing in order to address this humanitarian or human rights crisis? Or is there anything being done in a together way?
No, I think it's similar. What I find is that so far from what I've seen, the music world has done a lot more stuff together, and mainly for fundraising purpose. But I don't see the sporting world so much coming together to do stuff collectively. Similarly, in India, the individual cricketers, all the big names have done very important things. They've contributed personally, and some individual teams have done stuff. But the points which came out in our conversation with Jordi made that, and you made, Pao, that this is a moment for us to collaborate and not compete, and that we really have to put all our resources together and do stuff together. Like for example, one of the things I was thinking, since Netflix is now really kind of featuring Last Dance as a massive kind of hit in Netflix. Now, the possibility of using social media and Netflix, etc., to I don't know what the right name, whether it's it's a Dance to Last or the Best Dance, or where we could get some of the best players together within basketball, but also beyond, to think of how do we work together with the TikToks and the and that could be purely fundraising, or it could be a campaign against discrimination. Because one of the big challenges of COVID is how discrimination and inequality is playing out. And of course, we have to make it more concrete, but I see huge possibilities there. Either an advocacy push on the vaccines, a fundraising push on, say, Netflix and all the social media, or a mass campaigning against inequality and discrimination using your youth base, the base that each of you have in your own, but both not just nationally, but potentially globally as well. So I'll stop there. I don't want to take more time, Steve. I think there's I see huge opportunities here.
Would anybody like to respond to Salil? Because I think, maybe you have some thoughts about, Jordi, do you have some thoughts, or Malcolm, do you have some thoughts about what Salil had to say?
I would say, no, I think he's spot on to say that individually guys have, individual athletes or, certain ball clubs have stepped up and done some things, but we have yet to see just that collective voice in, organizing around, one real cause. And oftentimes, especially here in America, we like to, all lives matter, the issue, and really focus about this general conversation about, as a country, how we're being hit, as opposed to really focusing the efforts on who's being affected the most. And it obviously causes, it's a lot of politics involved. We got, people who aren't necessarily getting affected, who are from kind of the rural areas, but are not really seeing the effects of COVID, who are screaming to open the country back up. And then you have all of those, people who are in urban areas, who are in, public housing, close quarters, with all these other people where COVID is running rampant. We're trying to, obviously, slow that down. So I think, collectively, I think it's going to start with our leaders, and especially I think the sports industry has that ability to convene attention. And I think whether it's the NBA, MLB, NFL, and even the global ties that our sports have had, I think there's a great opportunity. But again, that comes down to the leadership of those leagues. And I know, at least in my league, hasn't been the most proactive when it comes to looking out for those, communities that are most at risk, or, people who are dealing with inequalities. And I think there's always been this tiptoe, kind of dance around politics and crises when it comes to sports, and I've dealt with it as well. where, you know, some people want to keep sports simply about sports, and that's that. You know, it's about profits, it's a business. But I think there's also a consciousness behind it that understands that sports has a larger responsibility to the society that feeds it. And I think, you know, we can continue to press on the leaders, not just the individual players, you know, because I thought it ironic that the NBA players were looking out for, you know, the stadium workers and things like that when, you know, there weren't that many NBA owners who were doing that. And I think, you know, that mentality needs to switch. And I think that starts with, obviously, the league leaders. It starts with our country's leaders, to be able to come together with not only a national plan to really, you know, galvanize people and give hope, but globally.
Well, I just wanted to add to that, as far as, I mean, this crisis and this pandemic, this really has reminded us how connected we all really are, how everyone's health affects everyone else's, and it has taken this highly infectious virus to make us understand that. And we have to also understand that crisis hit the most vulnerable first and hardest, right? So we have to identify, you know, who those people are, because as Salil was also saying, this is a human rights crisis right now. Kids in communities are not getting their meals, are not, you know, that's a human right. They're not getting their education by the lack of means. That's a human right. They're not getting a chance to play because they live in very confined or little residences. So they don't have access to their rights right now, and it's creating a really a human rights crisis. So we have to address that in a global way. And I think we've been reminded of how, again, how interconnected we are, that this virus does not really differentiate from class, color, or means. So obviously the people with more means have a better chance to get better care, but we have to be really directing our efforts in a global and united and coordinated way to tackle this virus. And I think, you know, whether it's through you know, putting our minds together, coming up with initiatives that we can work on locally, nationally, and also globally. You know, I have a friend, Jose Andres, who leads the World Central Kitchen. I don't know if you guys been following, and he's been delivering meals to people in need in this country and other countries. I think that he's delivered now over 10 million meals in America, and he has an initiative that is called Chefs for America. You know, what I've been thinking about is doing, you know, athletes for America, and then athletes for the world. You know, just we can escalate that and really try to have that global impact by really sports being one of the biggest drivers. It's one of the pillars of societies. So let's utilize that in order to have this great leadership and direction that is right now needed more than ever. You know, from the sports world, whether it's from the club like FC Barcelona with the initiative of donating their naming rights of the first year and potentially longer to the relief of COVID-19, and that could be applied to every club, every sport, every athlete, and athletes are role models in societies. Kids listen to what athletes say more than they listen to their parents. You know, that's a reality. You know, let's utilize that in a time of need like this one in order to send the right message, in order to do the right thing, in order to unite and bring the best out of people in a time of uncertainty and adversity. You know, that's the test that we're going through right now. You know, that's the chance that we have right now. Instead of, you know, looking out for our own or pointing fingers or criticizing or being more even segregated or separated than we were. You know, it's a time that we can really come together. It's an opportunity that I hope that we don't waste.
I'm absolutely convinced, Stephen. I'm absolutely convinced, as Pau said, we have in front of us a so big opportunity now, because when we talk about sports, traditionally we talk about a winner and a loser. And now it's time to understand that if we talk social, if we talk with this sensitive situation that we are today, we have to meet a win-win position. And when we talk about sports and values, it's difficult for us, even for people like me, that we try to explain to others what values means talking in sports. Now it's time to show examples, as we said before. Now it's time to make a stop and go, and not talk again and just act. And we have a big a big opportunity to act, to work together, and once more to collaborate and not to compete. And this is wonderful, and this is a big opportunity for human. Mm-hmm.
I wonder, these types of discussions don't usually take place across national boundaries. Now, I know at Barca it's a little bit different because you are such a global organization, but I think in the U.S. we tend to be a little bit more sort of confined to sort of national issues. So I wonder, and this is the challenge, right, of any academic endeavor. We have a conversation, but then we need to do something about it. And I wonder how we can kind of advance these discussions forward, and we can create relationships. I think, certainly the four of you who are participated tonight, there must be some way in which you can work together and certainly get to know each other. And it's my hope that we can go beyond the talking phase and we can go to the action phase. And I think the important thing is the level of commitment is very, very high. And because everybody realizes this is a crisis of a lifetime. I mean, this is something that we haven't seen in 100 years. This sort of has challenged, people in ways that they could have never imagined. And it may necessitate a new way of living. Not to be too gloom and doom, but Toby Ord, who's a philosopher at Oxford, has come out with a new book called Precipice. And in the book, he puts human extinction at about 6 to 1 in the next 100 years. So the challenges are immense. And I think, for all of you just engaging in this and sort of deciding that you're going to try to do the best you can and maybe finding out ways to partner with one another, will make a difference. And assuming a leadership role, because as I think Malcom pointed out, we're lacking sort of leadership in the world today. And so the sports world has a great opportunity to take up that role and to contribute.